Speaker is Ben Powless, who is a Mohawk young person from Six Nations and currently in Human Rights, Indigenous and Environmental Studies at Carleton University here in Ottawa. Ben works with both the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition and the Indigenous Environmental Network, and is involved in organizing the Power Shift Canada 2009 conference, taking place here in Ottawa, October 23rd to the 26th. With the goal of addressing the current climate and economic crisis, as well as the transition to an equitable, clean energy economy. So help me welcome Ben, please.
So, as talked about, I work with a group called the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition, and of course our main focus is on climate change. And of course that's become one of the biggest sort of key phrases in the past little while. Everybody talks about climate change, climate this, climate that. You got everybody from governments to big companies jumping on board saying, we're the best environmental choice right now. And I think that, just as Bina was talking about, it's an important time to talk about those kind of things and talk about it, the crisis that is involved, the risks that are talked about, but there's also a lot of opportunities that this, crisis talk allows for us. And I think it really allows us to address a lot of these related issues. Because I also agree that climate change, just like most environmental issues, doesn't really come down to an environmental problem. It comes down to a societal problem. It comes down to an economic problem. They're questions of the basic relationships that we have in society. They're questions of relations of gender, of workers, between races, between First Nations communities as resource extraction bases and cities, for example, or even between countries, the global north and the global south, such that here in Canada, for example, we're able to get away with not having so much industrial pollution as a matter of manufacturing, because most manufacturing is carried out in countries like China and sent here on our behalf. And it's those countries that have to deal with it. These are questions of relationships, and it's an important time to, I think, discuss a lot of those relationships that climate change sort of allows us as a sort of entry point into discussion. In Canada, though, we're not actually talking a lot about these relationships. We're not even dealing substantially with climate change as an outset. I recently heard a report from an environmental group that said as a response to the public's concern about climate change, which spiked overall in 2006, the government of Canada created a bunch of new parks. And that was supposed to be their big environmental response. Really, it was a lot of greenwashing. It was a lot of sort of cover-up efforts to say that they were doing something in response, but we haven't seen very much response at all. And really, what we need to be talking about is really transforming solutions that deal with a lot of the problems that I've mentioned, that deal with transforming the jobs that we have, dealing with the objects that we consume, dealing with the food that we eat, dealing with ending colonial relationships within Canada as well. And we're at the point now where a lot of environmental action that's proposed is of the order of, change your light bulb, when I think we really need to be considering changing our governments, changing our structure of governments. And we have a lot of proposals on the table that may actually worsen the situation. A lot of them are proposed under this rubric of apocalyptic talk. It's such an extreme measure. We have to go through such extreme measures that we need to be considering everything. And I don't think this is quite true, because a lot of these have, possible negative effects, environmental, social, or otherwise. And so you see a lot of, climate change or other environmental problems being used as an excuse, for example, to push things like nuclear power. They're being used as excuses to talk about, how do we make more coal but make it more sustainable? How do we do carbon sequestration while expanding the tar sands? How do we have the World Bank going into other countries and opening up more dams and displacing other communities? Or there are even more technological, science fiction sort of solutions where they talk about seeding the oceans with iron so that more algae will bloom and absorb more carbon, even though we have no idea what will happen long term. Or pumping chemicals into the sky to create more clouds at who knows what sort of effect in the possible future. So a lot of these solutions end up being really corporate solutions or solutions that result in more privatization, less community control, and don't allow us to sort of envision alternatives because of the amount of resources, time, dedication that they require, especially when you talk about really these technological solutions. These are outside of the realm of community action. They're outside of the realm of people in this audience being able to go and do anything about them. They sort of say we can only rely on governments and big companies to really solve these kind of problems. And that's a problematic way of addressing and framing the debate and really the realm of solutions. The reality, I think, is a lot more simple and has been being discussed for many years by especially impacted communities. We need to leave oil in the soil and the coal in the hole. In reference to the modern extraction, we need to also, leave long-standing ancient forests uncut. Even though they might be the nicest, softest things that you can blow your nose with, that's, a tragedy that we're actually, doing that here in Canada especially. We need to protect Indigenous communities and Indigenous rights. We need also to talk about lowering our consumption and stop buying products that we don't actually need. These are all things that really should be talked about when we talk about, dealing with the climate crisis and a lot of other crises that are related, the energy crisis, the economic crisis. How do we revitalize communities? How do we put communities in control? How do we make it so that people aren't so dependent on money, which is a fluctuating variable? I had a chance a little while ago, a few months ago, to travel to the Amazon. And I was in Peru at a time when a number of indigenous communities were engaged in protests against the government that was trying to enact a number of laws that would have opened up the Amazon to foreign oil, timber, mining, agriculture companies going in there. And they'd been waging these protests for a few months at that point. And I arrived just after a situation where the government decided that they weren't going to allow the protests anymore, and they sent in a number of government troops to stop the protests. And what erupted was a spate of violence that left over 30 people dead, many people missing, and hundreds of people in hospitals and jails across the region. And to be honest, I think these kind of communities were doing the most that I've ever heard of anybody doing to protect, the long-term sustainability of our planet, to stop climate change from happening. But these aren't the kind of things that we talk about. We don't actually talk about, how these communities are resisting, about how these communities are fighting for their rights and their important place in protecting the future of our planet. And reality is, I think that, protecting Indigenous rights, protecting human rights, talking about women's rights, these are all crucial elements, not just in Canada, but around the world, of really trying to address a lot of the basic problems of relationships, the basic problems of extraction, resources, and pollution that we have facing on the planet. Another example of that also comes from the Amazon, was a number of other communities are dealing with biofuels. And here in Canada, what we've mostly been told about biofuels is this great solution that, all of a sudden your gasoline has 10% biofuels, you're saving the planet. When in reality, a lot of these biofuels that are being grown around the world rely on places like the Amazon being cut down, the most pristine forests that we have in the world being cut down to grow cane sugar, soy, or other things that can be transformed into ethanol fuels. And the reality is, a lot of those, when you actually add up all of the industrial inputs, add up all the cost of transportation, of processing, refinery, of all of the aggregate inputs into creating biofuels, you end up with a product that uses more fuel than actual gasoline. But in reality, these are something that, increases corporate profits. There's something that fuel companies can use to say, all of a sudden we're doing something incredible for the environment, for people around the planet. But at the same time, they're causing massive displacement of communities across the Amazon, across other parts of, especially Indonesia, Malaysia. And they're also one of the biggest contributors to the recent food crisis around the world. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations estimates that biofuels were to account for about a third of the price increases that happened over the last 2 years, that sent over 1 billion people into hunger across the world. So what's being done then internationally? Well, the situation, I think, is even worse from official levels. The United Nations Climate Change Conference, one of their most recent meetings, just finished in Bangkok. And the next big meeting is set for Copenhagen in December. And that's where countries around the world will gather to try and come up with some sort of global climate treaty on the heels of the Kyoto Protocol, which is set to have its main targets expire in 2012. And the preliminary reports from a number of individuals and allies who are at this conference are that this agreement is going to suck. Basically, countries like Canada and the United States have said that they're not willing to continue on with the Kyoto Protocol's targets. These are targets that were set in the 1990s to reduce Canada's industrial emissions, very technically, by about 30%